This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kristen Musselman. I'm a scientist at the Toronto Rehab Institute and an assistant professor in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Toronto. As vice chair of the FES and Technology Task Force of the SCI Special Interest Group, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. Before I introduce our speakers, I have a few housekeeping details to review. First, please keep your phone lines or computers muted during the presentation. And second, there will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, so please save your questions until that time. If you think of a question during the presentation, feel free to type it into the chat box, and I'll be sure to read it out when the Q&A session begins. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Caitlin Hurd is a physical therapist and a PhD student in the Rehabilitation Sciences at the University of Alberta. She's also a member of the Women and Children's Health Research Institute. Caitlin studied animal models of spinal cord injury during her master's degree in neuroscience. Her current research interests include the rehabilitation of walking following neurological injury in both adults and children. Dr. Jaynie Yang is a professor in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Alberta. She's also a member of the Women and Children's Health Research Institute and the Neuroscience and Mental Health Institute at the university. She's a physical therapist with doctoral and postdoctoral training in biomechanics and neurosciences. Her research interests center on how the nervous system controls walking in humans and ways to retrain walking in individuals with neurological damage. Current interests include retraining walking in adults with spinal cord injury and early activity-intensive intervention for children at risk of developing cerebral palsy. So thank you, Caitlin and Dr. Yang, and I'll now mute my line and turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Kristen. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so what Caitlin and I have prepared is a presentation. We will each take about half of it and talk about powered exoskeletons for overground walking in spinal injury. And we had posted the learning objectives, which I assume you have access to, which is to become familiar with devices that are available in the United States and Canada, and to understand the literature up till now regarding benefits and limitations of these exoskeletons when used with spinal cord injured individuals. And then finally, to gain some awareness of the clinical considerations for the use of exoskeletons, and also include some of the user perspectives that we have been able to find out. So the focus of this presentation will be on overground walking. So that is powered exoskeletons which are used for overground walking. So in other words, I will not talk about Locomat and other gait trainers that are entirely like an elliptical or on a treadmill. And we're going to focus on the spinal cord injured population, and as I already mentioned, FDA-approved devices. And we're going to also, in presenting, incorporate some of our experiences, which is with the ReWalk exoskeleton. And so our personal experience in terms of running research studies is using the ReWalk. And then we have a little bit of personal experience with some of the other devices, just so that you know where we're coming from. So Caitlin has used the Exo. She's been in one herself, that's what I mean. And both of us have been in the ReWalk. And then I have also been in the Indigo. So I have a little bit of a sense of how easy they are to use and that sort of thing. Neither of us have been in the Hull, which we'll mention as well. So when we think of powered exoskeletons for walking, we tend to think it's a very recent thing, but actually it isn't. And just out of interest, I included this, which we found the earliest patent was in the 1800s. We can't tell exactly how this old system worked, but it was for powering people to walk over ground. So getting to the ones, the exoskeletons that are approved for use in North America. So there are 4 of them that we know of. And on the left-hand side, so there's the Exo, and it is by Exobionics, and that is out of the United States. And then there's a hybrid assistive limb, or HAL, and that's out of Japan. And both these devices are specifically for rehabilitation. So that means they can only be used in rehab centers. And in contrast, on the right-hand side, you have the ReWalk and the Indigo. So ReWalk is out of Israel, Indigo is USA. And these two devices are both for rehabilitation and for personal use, meaning that if you wanted to, you could buy one and take it home with you. So because the original design of these and the thinking of the companies when they made them are a little bit different, and their market was a little different. So the result was, I think, that the devices are somewhat different in the way that they operate. So what we're going to do initially is just tell you a little bit about what we know in terms of the similarities between the devices and then the differences. So some things are quite similar. For example, all the devices, all four of them, have motors that work at the hip and the knee bilaterally. So they make movements at those joints. The ankle is fixed in all the devices. And some of them have a little bit of a spring load to them, but they don't have motors. And then all four devices are battery powered, and the kind of durability of the battery is different, I think, and it's even different when you use it with different people on the same device. So whatever the manufacturers say is not always exactly right. And then in terms of weight, they are quite similar in a way. They're somewhere between 30 to 45 pounds. And because all the devices have foot plates, I don't know if you noticed that, it means that the whole device and the weight of it is borne directly to the ground. And so the person wearing it doesn't have to carry that weight around. So the weight is a little bit, in my view, less of a concern. And then the cost of these devices, so they are very expensive. 3 of them you can actually purchase. So the Exo, the ReWalk, and the Indigo, you can buy them, and they, depending on the features that you choose and that sort of thing, it's somewhere in the $100,000 US range. The hull can only be rented, as far as I understand, and it's rented at a monthly rate of $6,000 US. So it is not cheap either. So now I'll go over the differences between the devices. So the first difference, it's a fairly big difference actually, is how easy it is to put on. And so the Indigo is kind of unique in that it comes in sections. So this is shown on the right-hand side. It has actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections, and they can all fit into a bag. It looks like a gym bag, actually. And so it's easy to get around, and when the person puts it on, and they actually have a video showing that, I think it's a lot easier for a spinal injured person to don this device because you put them on in pieces. You put on the leg, then you put on the thigh, and then you snap them together. So that's a lot, in many ways, easier to do on your own for a person with injury. The other devices, as far as I know, are all one piece. Now, the hull may be a little bit different because I know the least about that. I had a discussion and video conference with their salespeople to understand it. It does appear to come in pieces, but I don't know exactly whether they actually assemble all the pieces as you want them and then get the person in, or whether you can actually snap them into place. So I don't know about that. The Exo and ReWalk are all one-piece devices, as shown in these pictures. But the difference with the Exo is that you can see that the hip can be abducted, and so the person can get into the seat, transfer to the seat, and then snap the legs in. So in a way, I think it is easier to get into. Whereas you can imagine the ReWalk, because it's fixed, you're going to have to transfer over top of the thigh segment in order to get into it. So you have to be a good a person who really has a good transfer. You couldn't be using a sliding board or anything, a transfer board or anything like that. Another difference is the foot plates, which I think is also important. So you can see they all have a foot plate to them, but the ones on the right-hand side, those foot plates fit inside the shoe. And so they may or may not, I don't know which is better. I've only used the ReWalk. Some of the issues with fitting it inside the shoe is, first of all, that you have to get it in the shoe, which means you have to have a somewhat bigger shoe than they would normally wear. And then you have to be sure that the fit is good, otherwise you might have abrasions on the foot. So there are still some issues. It's not a huge issue, but it is a little bit more difficult, I think, for the person to get into the device. The Exo is the only one in which the shoe fits outside of the foot plate. So the foot plate is under the sole of your shoe. And so that is easy to get into. Another very big difference, I think, is the trunk support. So you see on the right-hand side, the Indigo, ReWalk, and Hull have a pelvic segment and no support above that. The Hull is the same, actually. This piece that you see is not supporting the trunk. This is just for their electronics. And so it means that the person using it will have to control their trunk somehow using their walking aids or have some trunk control themselves. And the Exo is different again, so it has a rigid back support. And so someone who has lower function, I suspect, would do better in an Exo. Now, the one big issue with these devices is that falls are likely to happen and are difficult to prevent. So, for example, the ReWalk and Indigo do not have any protection for falls. You cannot tether it. Now, you might be able to fit a harness underneath the system, but we have never tried, and I think it would be very tricky. So basically, the trainers are responsible for keeping these people safe. And so the way we do it, and you will see video of it, is that we always had 2 people with them. So one in the back with hands on the pelvic band, and then a person in front to spawn. So that's a big issue. That means manpower is high. On the left, you see the Exo, which has a system that you can tether the device to an overhead track. And they don't sell overhead tracks, but if you have one, you can tether it. And then the Hull is only allowed to be used with body weight support. So that means either on the treadmill or over ground, and I'll show you pictures of that in a minute. But I think that the one issue with the tether is, yes, it will prevent falls to the ground, but it's not going to be, I think, necessarily great because it's very limiting in terms of the kinds of terrains you can try and things that you can try with the device. So I think that this is a big issue, the fall and how to deal with this issue. Here's just a picture showing you the Hull device used on a treadmill and used over ground using some kind of body weight support. And then walking aids are also what you can use is a little bit different. The Hull, because it's used on the treadmill and overground with body weight support, it doesn't usually have anything else that you would use with it. The Exo and Indigo can both be used with a walker or forearm crutches. And then the ReWalk is primarily used with the forearm crutch, although I think, Caitlin, you said that, yeah, some people have tried it with the walker. Another difference is how the steps are triggered. So the ReWalk, Exo, and Indigo are based on a mechanical feedback from the system. The exact mechanical feedback is different between the different systems. I believe the Exo is a left-right weight shift kind of trigger. The ReWalk is a slight forward-backward lean of the trunk or pelvis, I guess, more accurately. And then the Indigo, I think, is a combination of those two, although I don't know exactly what it is. But when I was in it, I found it very intuitive. So whatever it's using as feedback, it does work quite well. The hull is the only one that's different, and it uses EMG biofeedback. So you can put a number of EMG electrodes on and use it as feedback to trigger the device. So because I've never tried it, I really have no idea how well that would work, and I think that their intention is to use it with people who are less injured, who have the potential to be overground walkers without using an exoskeleton. So it's a little bit different in terms of the market they were aiming for. And then whether or not the device can be programmed to assist more or less the user is different. So the three devices shown first, Exo, Indigo, and Hull, have all incorporated some form of tailored assistance. So if a person gets, for example, is getting stronger, you can back off the motors, and if you have bilateral kind of use of what I'm trying to say is if you had a person who had a very good asymmetrical ability, one leg is much more able than another, you can obviously tailor that. And so it means that it can be used for many different pathologies, not just spinal injury, and many different abilities of users. The ReWalk doesn't have that capability. It was the earliest machine out, and so I think for that reason, many more fancy features have been incorporated in the newer devices. And then finally, the last thing I'll say here is that we scoured the literature in preparation for this webinar, and what we found was that most of the information available out there has to do with walking outcomes, and also that each of the devices has quite different amounts of publications, in English, I mean, and it seems to be related to when their FDA approval was accepted. So first of all, there's lots of walking outcome studies out there, and then a little bit on physiological effects of using these devices, and then a small amount of user perspective information. The other thing is that most of the studies are used in chronically injured people, and so there's very limited information on subacute injured people and whether or not it would be suitable. I believe it's the large European consortium that had included some subacutely injured people. And then we are aware of a paper coming out very soon, which was used specifically in the subacute population, and it's coming out of Calgary by Chester Holmes Group. Okay, and I'm going to now pass it over to Caitlin. Thank you.
Okay, so with that overview of the different devices, then the next question is kind of who can use these devices. So there are a few fairly consistent inclusion and exclusion criteria. So these primarily relate to actually fitting in the device, but then also safety as well. So as far as inclusion goes, the height ranges from about 5 feet to just over 6 feet tall, but this really depends on the different length of the segments of the leg, so the thigh and the lower leg. For the weight, generally less than about 220 pounds. And this, in our case especially, was to kind of protect the person who was guarding and actually make sure that they were, if you aren't able to have them on an overhead track, to make sure that you were ensuring their safety within the device. And then one inclusion criteria that is quite variable and was sort of one of the ideas behind the study that we did was the different level and severity of injury. So generally, they're marketed towards T4 or lower complete injuries, or C5 or lower incomplete. As you might imagine, based on that introduction to the hall, that device specifically is designed for people who have more activity. So generally lower level completes for somebody who is able to activate those muscles to some extent. And then the exclusion criteria, something like severe spasticity would prevent the ability for the device to actually go through the range of motion that's required. This is similar to contractures. You need a certain range of motion in each of the joints for safety for those joints. Wounds, so this is pretty self-explanatory. The skin issues, which I'll touch on, are one of the bigger concerns in using these devices. So if somebody already has wounds, you don't want to be making those worse. And then bone integrity as well. So we know that people's bone density decreases after spinal cord injury quite dramatically. And so again, to ensure their safety, especially if they are at risk of falling in these devices, bone integrity is a concern. And this is generally excluded using the occurrence of a fracture within the last 2 years, or in our case, we use T-scores, so bone density scanning of less than 3 or less than 2.5. So our study, this is kind of just an overview just to show that given those inclusion and exclusion criteria, we didn't have a ton of participants that were eligible after screening everybody out. So we screened 51 individuals, and then 39 of those were excluded. Those who declined, there were 12 of them, and it was likely because it was an intensive training program, and so they were required to come in 4 days a week, which was quite a bit. But the people who were excluded because they were inappropriate was for reasons, as I kind of mentioned earlier, the contractures, active pressure sores, really low bone density, or a history of fractures or other medical issues. So we ended up enrolling 12 participants in our study. One of them dropped out after standing in the exoskeleton for the first time, saying it just wasn't for them. And one person dropped out halfway through because of an unrelated injury. So we ended up with 11 people total, and 10 of those throughout the whole course of the training. And so just to kind of compare this to some of the literature, it depends on how you define screening and included or excluded, but the numbers do seem similar, especially if you look at this Benson study, which is comparable to kind of what we saw in that they screened 60 and included only 10. So as Jaynie mentioned, there isn't a lot of literature on these devices. It's just coming out, and most of the literature is these kind of prospective cohort studies. So a single intervention where you're measuring things at baseline and then providing a training in a device and then kind of assessing your outcomes at that point. So the training varied in the literature from about 20 to 60 sessions. And then within a session could take 30 minutes to up to an hour and a half each day. And they were coming in 3 to 5 days per week in the different studies. In our case, we actually followed up after training, 2 months after the end of training as well, just to see if any changes were maintained. So to give kind of an idea of what this looks like, this is one of our participants walking outside for the first time. This person had walked indoors for a few weeks, and then you can see we went outside, which is one of the perks of having an overground exoskeleton. And she was able to manage the uneven terrain, but you can tell the personnel required, as Jaynie mentioned, we have one person in the back and then another in the front spotting for safety. And then this video shows somebody later on in their training. This ReWalk is actually an older model. You can kind of tell it looks a bit bulkier, but this person was able to manage uneven terrain quite easily. We also did stairs with a few of our participants early on. The reason we didn't do it with all of them is because you'll kind of get a sense of it while watching this, but it wasn't the safest feature we kind of decided. And also the stair function, as far as I know, is not enabled with the FDA approval in the States with the ReWalk. And I do know that there are more recent versions, they've updated the software for the stair function, but we didn't have a chance to check that out when we were training. So one of our main questions in starting this study was, what kind of dose do these people need to become proficient walkers? So these are graphs from our participants. So this is, again, is the ReWalk. And we were interested in kind of measuring proficiency. So that is the number of sessions required to reach 80% of their kind of final performance. And so we assessed this over a few different outcomes. So total steps, distance, and speed were some of them. And overall, it seemed that they needed about 45 sessions, again, over all of these, to be proficient walkers in the ReWalk. And certain outcomes came about faster than others. So for example, you see this green line here indicates that proficiency level for speed. So people were achieving kind of their max speed fairly early on, after about 20 some sessions, whereas something like distance took quite a bit longer before they were able to, distance and total steps, before they were able to kind of develop that endurance to keep going for that full hour and achieve those longer distances. And you can see the gray in here is one standard deviation. So you can see that the learning was fairly variable, and our numbers weren't large enough to comment on exactly what related to that, but you can imagine things like age of the participant or time since injury, level and severity of injury would kind of factor into those things. So to compare with another study, so again on the left here is that graph of total steps, and then over the session number in the ReWalk where we were doing 1 hour of training. On the right is a graph showing training in the exoskeleton, and they were doing 30-minute training sessions, but you can see they seem to reach their 80% proficiency earlier on, only after a few sessions, because they sort of plateau after a while. So this may be suggesting that the Exo, for example, is an easier device to learn how to use. We're not entirely sure, but that's sort of what it seems. Walking speeds in the device after training were comparable among the different devices. So they're kind of ranging between 0.3 meters per second and 0.4. So these are generally assessed on a 10-meter walk test. And this graph is showing the square is the mean for the different devices, and then the bars are indicating the range. So you can see there is quite a range for most of these devices, and that they are reaching speeds that are comparable to an individual with spinal cord injury walking within their home, but it is still a fairly slow speed if you compare it to a functional community ambulator. We also looked at 6-minute walk test, so this is looking at endurance, and again we're looking at the mean for each of these devices as well as the range and the distance that was covered. And again, these are fairly comparable. They sort of hover around 100 meters within those 6 minutes for all the different devices. So another thing we were interested in is if you're talking about the purposes of these devices in rehab, but then also potentially using them in the community, we're curious about how much effort it takes to actually use these devices. So this is a rate of perceived exertion scale, the Borg scale. And generally, those who reported RPE scores, or rate of perceived exertion scores, hovered around 10 to 11 on average, so sort of a light level of exertion, with a range of about 7, so extremely light, to 15, so a harder task. And this was consistent between the Exo and the ReWalk anyway, those two devices. So then how does this compare to other measures of walking effort and that sort of thing? So some reported METs, and you can see that those ranged about 2.3 and 2.7. So this is compared to resting seated level. And then VO2, so this is oxygen consumption. This is similar, sort of showing the same sort of effect, that you're seeing either twice as much oxygen consumption or 2.5 times as much oxygen consumption when you're walking as compared to resting, sitting down before walking. Okay, so another thing that's reported in the literature is the adverse events. So I'll get into kind of the specific events that are reported. One paper kind of grouped all their events and sort of indicating that they were minor adverse events, and they were things like skin abrasions, lightheadedness when standing up, or edema in the legs, which was reported in other studies as well. By and large, skin abrasions were the most common adverse event reported. So as you can see, a number of studies here using a ReWalk reported about 50% of their participants having skin abrasions from using the device. And typically these tend to be, as you would imagine, where the device is contacting the skin, but especially around the pelvic band. Some reports around the knee area and the straps around there, and also at the foot plate as well, as Jaynie kind of mentioned, especially if you imagine a foot plate in the shoe. If you get rubbing there, you'll get that kind of skin abrasion. And then this is contrasted with a study from the EXO, which reported only 20% of participants. So again, maybe suggesting that there is a difference between the devices there in terms of the risk for skin abrasions. There were a few reports of overuse injury, and typically this was in the form of ankle swelling. So this paper, they specifically mentioned that these 3 people who had this overuse injury were chronic, people with chronic spinal cord injury. And so they potentially hadn't been involved in an intensive gait program or standing program in some time. And so they attribute the ankle swelling to that sort of thing. Another adverse event is falls. So this is, as Jaynie mentioned, kind of one of the more concerning ones. So this paper here with the EXO had 8 falls while they were tethered, and it was 3 different people who fell a total of 8 times. So again, the EXO is one you can tether, so the tether sort of prevented any significant injuries with that. In our study, we had 2 falls, and again, as you saw, you weren't able to tether the ReWalk. We didn't have any injuries with these falls. They were controlled by the person holding the pelvic band. But I think it is important to note that one of these falls occurred with one of our more experienced participants, and she was just walking as she typically does, and we just happened to have somebody behind because we always did, and the spotter behind was able to lower her slowly to the ground. But it's not that these falls are occurring, within the first few times up for the first week of training. It can be later on as well. Some physiological changes. So transient reductions in pain have been reported, and these are typically done using a numeric rating scale, or that's NRS there. And these tend to be over the course of a training session. So people report lower levels of pain after training. In this last paper here with the ReWalk, one participant reported that their pain was worse after using the device. But generally, people seem to report short-term reductions in pain. And then this is similar to reductions in spasticity. So again, this is measured in different ways. These 2 are looking at the modified Ashworth scale. And they found a statistically significant reduction in spasticity. And others are self-reported kind of reductions in spasticity. So another thing we were particularly interested in is balance. So again, this one was measured different ways, not necessarily consistent across the literature, but one paper mentioned significant improvements in the Berg balance scale with their participants. The way we measured balance was we had participants sit on a force plate, and then their feet were unsupported and they were leaning in 8 different directions and coming back to center, maintaining their balance. And so we were checking in to see if their limits of stability were increasing, which we did find increases in that. And then there was also reports of self-reported improvements in balance. This last point here is a study that compared the exoskeleton training on a treadmill, so the Locomat is what they were using, versus the Exo Overground. And they found that the exoskeleton overground recruited more trunk musculature, which you would imagine, and so they kind of imagine that this is what's contributing to some of those improvements in balance, is that you're recruiting this trunk musculature that isn't necessarily challenged when you're walking in something like a Locomat over the treadmill. So other reported outcomes, they've found significant increases in lean body mass in the legs and decreases in fat body mass with training. And then another one that hasn't been really systematically studied, but seems to be fairly common within the literature, is improved bowel function. So this is primarily done through self-reports. So looking at time for bowel routines and frequency. And there seems to be improvements with this, and this is sort of what our participants were kind of echoing as well, that there were improvements with that. And then another outcome was quality of life and emotional well-being. Again, this is measured in different ways. A number of different questionnaires are kind of used, but typically people are reporting improvements in quality of life and well-being, satisfaction. And this is especially the case for people with chronic spinal cord injury as compared to people who were more recently acquired their injury. So one of the other things we assessed is the usability. So again, I think it's kind of important to think about these devices that are approved for use at home and people are maybe considering acquiring one for home use. One of our questions is like, okay, well, what are the limitations if you were to take it home? And so we have a simulated kitchen here at the faculty that we were able to use. And so we assessed things like standing at the sink and washing dishes, reaching into cupboards, both above as well as below, or trying to reach below, using the stove, those kind of thing. And people kind of had different strategies for using these sorts of things. Often they would kind of lean against the counter or use one crutch to sort of reach things while they were standing. But many of them reported that they enjoyed being able to stand up in the kitchen, for sure. One of the concerns with this is being able to start and stop the device on command, especially where you want. If you're in a tight space, you have to be fairly precise, and so that requires some time learning the device for sure and getting comfortable with it. Opening doors that swing backwards towards the person were almost impossible without an assistant. The device, as you can imagine, only walks forward, and so it was sort of this like shimmying kind of routine to sort of open a door or just having assistance of somebody. And then as you saw in the video, we took the device outside as much as possible, and this included different surfaces like gravel and different concrete, that kind of thing. And then we did a field test at a grocery store, and so crossing an intersection as well. And then this chart is lots of information, but I just kind of want to highlight a few things. So this is looking at the number of participants who could do the given task independently out of the number that we tried it with. So you'll notice that a number of these things we didn't necessarily try with everybody. So going up and down ramps or using the wrist control. Typically, just for ease of use, we would have the wrist control on, which sort of selects the different walk mode or sit, that kind of thing. But some participants wanted to use it, and generally they were able to do that on their own. Going up and down ramps is actually a fairly difficult task to do. So it does require quite a bit of upper extremity strength to do that. And so most of our participants weren't actually able to go up and down steep ramps. One of the more difficult things too, which maybe isn't exactly intuitive, is actually getting into the device and being able to insert and extract the foot. And so the reason that this is difficult is because people have to lean forward to some extent, and then again, if their balance isn't great, they're kind of losing their balance forward before they're strapped into the device. And so that can be something that is very difficult, and that's what we found, is most people required assistance to do that. And then again, as I sort of alluded to, within the kitchen, because you're strapped into the device and don't have any way to flex at the torso or the hips, really, people weren't able to reach any of the low cupboards or anything in the kitchen. So another component of our study was looking at these qualitative results. So again, we know that people are reporting improvements in life satisfaction, but we didn't have necessarily a great idea of how they felt about training, their expectations for training, and participating in the study and these sorts of things. So especially when you're talking about developing technology for an end user, it's, we think, very important to have the end user's perspective. And so we had a qualitative aspect of our study as well. And so this, we did semi-structured interviews before training, following training, and then again at that 2-month follow-up time point. And so we were asking things about, what are your expectations? What do you know about these sorts of devices? What have you seen? And then after training, if we said we could give you one for free, would you take it? And we got some interesting kind of results from that. So overall, in the middle here, like everyone else, that was sort of the theme that that came out of the qualitative study. People were saying that they just felt like the ReWalk or an exoskeleton in general was giving them an opportunity to do regular things. So one mentioned kicking leaves with his son outside, and another mentioned, again, like standing in the kitchen, and the thought of being able to cook again like they used to was really exciting. And then we had 3 different themes as well. So contributing was one. So this was contributing to the research, but then also contributing to our knowledge on the device and giving feedback from the user's perspective, with somebody who had been in it for 3 months, to kind of give a sense to the developers of the technology, what works and what doesn't, and that kind of thing. Learning, so this was people's expectations for the device, but then also their experiences throughout the learning process. And then changing, that 3rd theme was, again, some of those other like psychological, emotional well-being changes, and then physical changes. So they commented on spasticity, bowel and bladder changes, or pain, those sorts of things. So these are just some quotes just to kind of give an indication of what people were saying. One person mentioned that when they walk, they feel independent, and they said that when I stand with people, we're equal. So this idea of standing being very important. People mentioned looking eye to eye with people. When we asked about if somebody would want to take one home, one person who said no, most people said yes, that they would take one for free. One of the people who said no said it was because they wouldn't feel confident enough to use it on their own. They felt that they weren't safe using it without the spotter behind it in front. And so they didn't think they would use it at home, but they would like to have access to one. So this idea of accessibility of these sorts of devices is something to consider for sure. In talking about learning, a number of people mentioned it was like riding a bike. And so it's this idea of this implicit motor learning. And we found that when people had to take breaks from training, so for example, if they had a skin abrasion and we had to give it a week or 2 to heal, they would come back and they would be kind of exactly where they left off pretty much. They didn't lose any of their ability to use the device. People talking about psychological, emotional well-being, and the idea of using an exoskeleton as an eye-opener, and something that was found to be very encouraging. And then again, boosting confidence and bringing back kind of this joy from using one of these devices. So overall, we've kind of found in the literature sort of suggests that these powered exoskeletons are safe as an adjunct to other forms of rehab after spinal cord injury. Again, the most common adverse events being skin issues primarily, and then these considerations for safety, especially prevention of falls. And I think this second point is really important, thinking about what these devices were used for. So some devices designed for rehab and others approved for home use. So this sort of dictates who can maybe use these devices and which devices might be better suited for things like rehab, if you can do a variable assist, or if you are having somebody activate throughout the walking cycle, versus using it at home in the kitchen and that kind of thing. And so this sort of speaks to the next point, in that we aren't entirely sure, which level of injury, what severity of injury, time since injury, all these sorts of things, and that's sort of still being investigated. And then training in the devices, as you've seen, as we've kind of shown, has been associated with both physical and psychological benefits for sure.
And then finally, just to mention some of the future directions, I think that the further improvements in the design will be very important to address this risk of falls and to address some of these issues with usability. And then, as Caitlin mentioned, all the studies we could find were the single intervention type of cohort study. And so I think that more rigorous designs will be needed to compare the efficacy of these devices compared to other training methods for walking. And then as a mobility and rehab tool, or rehab tool, I guess, because they're designed for different devices for different things. The feasibility with respect to both the cost of the device and the personnel required to be able to train someone, I think really will have to be addressed if these devices are really going to be useful to a lot of people. So that's all we have, and we're happy to take questions.
So thank you so much, Caitlin and Dr. Yang. That was a really fantastic overview of powered exoskeletons. So we can take questions at this time. If either Dr. Gorgi or Dr. Zonka has a question, please feel free to ask.
So this is Ashraf Gorgi, and I want to congratulate you on this excellent presentation, because really it is a nice review as well as just kind of an eye-opener for the future and what we need to address. But I didn't realize that in your presentation you highlight any of the work that which is the future, which is hybrid work between exoskeleton, electrical stimulation, exoskeleton, and BCI. How about this work, or what do you think about this upcoming work about using exoskeleton with other technology?
Yes, so yeah, we are aware of the development of those types of systems. I do not know of any that really are commercially available, although I think it's certainly a promising way to go. I don't think it will be an easy way. From my understanding of using stimulation to control walking is quite a high order. So it will be very interesting to see. I think that it would be good in the sense that it might add a certain element of training that is not possible without it. And so I'm kind of watching what's developing, but yeah, right now those are not available.
Good. And I have another question about some of our exoskeleton findings that we have in our lab. So we have shown that a minimum of once or twice a week of training with exoskeleton up to 60 to 75 minutes is not published result, but I'm just sharing with you, can lead to improvement in motor, I don't want to say motor recovery, but EMG characteristics. What do you think about something like this? Is this something in complete injury, I should say, incomplete injury? Is this something that we should expect, or would be some motor learning experience, or what's going on in here?
Well, I think, well, it's hard to know what is causing what, but certainly I assume you're sort of asking a two-piece thing that is 1 or 2 times a week enough for learning. I think that's one aspect. And then what exactly is this thing doing? So I think that, yeah, so for the frequency of the intervention, we actually think around 3 times may be the optimal, because we started actually the study with 5 times a week. And then we found right away that it was a little too much for the people, that they started to not perform as well at the end of the week. So we switched it to 4 times a week. And I now think even 3 times a week would probably be sufficient. But whether 1 time a week would be enough, I am not sure. That seems very little, but probably it would just take a little longer, I suspect. People do learn. I think a little bit more frequent would be better. 2 times may be enough. I don't know. So somewhere in the 3 times-ish range, I think, is probably optimal. But I don't have data.
We're trying to do 2 times, but you're right. We're trying to do 2 times at a longer duration. I realize you said 60 minutes, so we go a little bit like 2 times 75 minutes. So kind of like to try to have concentrated walking and increase the number of steps and distance. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree with you. 1 time a week may be, but we started 1 time a week just to see if any benefits can. Maybe we started the opposite way. You started with 5 days a week. We started 1 time. So, so we're going to meet somewhere in the middle, hopefully.
Yeah, I do think that probably is. And it's interesting to try sort of a more intensive bout and less frequently. I really don't have a sense of what would be better. Some of our participants had trouble with their wrists if we went for too long, especially in the beginning when they first started. So maybe you'd have to ramp it up a bit in terms of the duration of training each day. But yeah, I think that those are all very interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is Jean Zanka at Kessler Foundation in West Orange, New Jersey, and I appreciated this presentation as well, particularly including qualitative data analysis as well. I think that gives a very nice dimension to people's experiences. I had a question about the involvement of occupational therapy in the training of the use of exoskeletons. So my impression with programs happening here at our center and at some other collaborating centers is that a lot of the focus tends to be on more aspects of the physical therapy components of things with respect to walking and on level surfaces and ramps and things of this nature, and not as much using exoskeletons in the context of ADLs as you were showing, working in the kitchen, for example. What gaps do you see in the current research work or clinical work with respect to the use of exoskeletons in contexts other than just locomotion?
That's a good question. Yeah. I think that's a really good question. We didn't really train people to use the device in those situations like a kitchen. We just tested it at the end when they were really good walkers. But I think it's very possible, we think, that they would get a lot better at those tasks if they had some training specifically for those tasks. So yeah, definitely that I think if someone was going to use it at home, they really should have an occupational therapist or somebody who's really familiar with that type of task to train them in those environments.
And especially too for things like I mentioned, the getting into and out of it, and strategies to, safer strategies to put your feet in or take them out. I feel like an occupational therapist would be very well suited to address some of those concerns.
Yeah.
Excellent. And for full disclosure, I'm a PT, not an OT, but I still as a gap. And I appreciate that you even looked at it. I think that's helpful in kind of rounding out the picture as well, especially when it comes to, just differences in sort of the physical configuration of some of these devices, what things bump into countertops and, those kinds of logistical issues. It's really useful to shed light on that. So thank you for looking at it.
Thank you.
And so it's Kristen again. I had one quick question, if that's okay, and it's about falls. So I know in some of the work that Jaynie and I have done in the past, we have tracked near falls, which can be challenging. But did you guys track that in this study?
No, we didn't. Yeah. And it's very hard to track that kind of thing in an exoskeleton because in the beginning, you're almost helping them entirely. So, your hands are on and you're helping them shift their weight and all that. And then it's sort of gradually you back off, right? So that's the issue. We could have probably towards the end done a session where we just specifically looked for the frequency of falls. That might have been a good thing to do. And we know that the different people were very different. So some people were very good at it, but then as Caitlin said, the odd time they might fall, whereas others, even at the end, we were still helping them.
Yeah, so I was curious, I find it very interesting because you were saying how, in one of the two falls, it was actually a very proficient walker. And I think that's true of just mobility and falls in general. So it's not just the exoskeleton, it's sometimes it's the confident, or people tend to fall in situations where they're feeling more confident, right? So I was just curious about, if you had any other data that could look at that. And did you get a sense from the qualitative data, like how their confidence changed with using the device over time?
Yeah, we sort of did. People spoke about kind of in the theme of learning about having to really focus initially and not being so sure and really depending on the spotters to like kind of it becoming an intuitive thing, and then they were happy to go outside and they were okay with like people around in the hallway and stuff, all those kinds of distractions. So I did get the sense, that over time people became more confident. But then again, you had a few of them who sort of recognized sort of the limitations of their ability as well, even at the end. But I would say overall, yeah.
Great. So thank you. Unless there's any other questions, I think we can bring the webinar to a close. So thanks to both of you again for your time and preparation to share this talk, which I think will be great to be able to share with our members going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you.